Travel with me into the twilight of forgotten lives, where history thins into mist and the voices of the past drift like faint lantern light across a quiet marsh. In this hour, let us move gently, without hurry, as though the world were holding its breath and waiting for an old memory to rise. There are stories that once lived loudly in the hearts of their people, yet over time they slipped beneath the surface, leaving only echoes behind. Tonight we follow one such echo, a voice woven into the reeds and tides of southern Louisiana, a voice belonging to a woman who lived at the edge of things. Her name was Julia Brown, though the world that remembers her does so with a mix of reverence and tremor, as if her presence were carved not only into the earth she walked, but into the air that once held her song. Before we enter her life, feel the stillness of the landscape that shaped her legend. Imagine the wide and patient swamp at the dawn of the 20th century, its waters dark and unmoving beneath towering cypress trees draped in moss that swayed like heavy curtains. In this place, the boundary between living and lost felt thin, and people learned to listen not just with their ears but with their skin, which recognized changes in the wind, the deep groan of shifting earth, and the subtle language spoken by unseen currents. The swamp was a world that carried memory differently, not in stone arches or written walls, but in ripples, in bird calls, in the damp breath of morning rising off the water. Into this world was born a woman who would grow to be both its daughter and its interpreter, a figure whose name would travel far beyond the broken piers of Frenier, far beyond the ruins left by a storm, and deep into the corridors of folklore. When we speak her name now, we do so through the haze of stories gathered over more than a century, some whispered in awe, some spoken with fear, others shaped by the loneliness of a community that needed meaning more than it needed truth. To understand her is to wander between fact and memory, to step across thresholds where reason softens and history takes on the quiet glow of myth. Julia lived in an era defined by uncertainty, when illness moved silently through small towns, when labor was hard and support was fragile. Communities clung tightly to anything that offered comfort, even if it stood just beyond the borders of the visible world. She became, slowly and almost imperceptibly, a figure people turned to in moments of suffering. Some sought medicines, others sought blessings, and still others sought explanations for the unexplainable. Over time, her presence settled over the town like the steady hum of a chorus line sung softly at night. Yet long before her name was wrapped in legend, long before anyone called her a priestess or spoke of her with caution, she was simply a woman living along the quiet edge of Lake Pontchartrain, tending to those around her, with a knowledge she had carried since childhood. Knowledge of plants, of healing, of rhythms older than her lifetime. Knowledge inherited through generations who understood the world as a place where suffering demanded both practical remedies and spiritual reassurance. In such a world, every healer became a bridge between what is known and what is felt. Still, Julia remained to her neighbors an enigma. She spoke little of herself, and in her silence people found room to weave their own interpretations. They noticed how she moved with a calm that felt older than her years, how she watched storms forming long before any cloud appeared on the horizon, how she seemed to hear sounds they themselves could not. Some said she was gifted, others said she was marked. All agreed she was not to be dismissed, and so her reputation grew slowly like the moss over the cypress trunks, until her presence felt inseparable from the landscape itself. Yet legends do not arise from serenity alone. They gather strength from tension, from loneliness, from the quiet ache that settles in a person who carries the burdens of others for too long. Imagine her sitting alone on her wooden porch as dusk fell across the swamp, listening to the crickets begin their nightly song. The air thick, holding the scent of wet earth. Her voice, when she sang, was soft and low, the kind of sound that drifted easily across the surface of water. Those who heard it would later say she hummed melodies that felt like warnings, though in truth, no one could ever be sure what she meant by them. That is the nature of myth. It grows in the spaces where certainty has thinned. As night deepens, imagine her bare feet resting on the porch boards worn smooth by time, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of lantern light. Behind her, a small cabin filled with jars of herbs, handwritten remedies, and objects whose meanings were understood only by her. Ahead, the expanse of dark water, waiting. She was a solitary figure, but not lonely. There was a sense in her of someone who understood that life holds many layers, some too delicate to speak of openly, and perhaps this understanding gave her the aura people later described. Something gentle, yet unsettling. Something that made her seem both part of the community and far beyond it. As we drift with her through these early moments, listen to the hum that surrounds her. The swamp has a music of its own, a slow vibration that presses against the boundaries of silence. It is within this music that her story begins, not with thunder or spectacle, but with the smallest flicker of a tune carried over the marsh. Tonight we follow that tune. It rises softly, as if from another room in time, a room where her voice still moves in circles, returning again and again to a melody that outlived her. It is faint now, almost lost beneath the weight of years, but if you lean close, you may hear the echo of her humming, drifting across the water like a forgotten promise. It begins quietly, then fades, leaving only the image of a distant light trembling on the surface of the swamp, and in that trembling light, the story waits. That faint, trembling light on the surface of the swamp opens the doorway into the beginning, into the place where Julia Brown first stepped out of anonymity and into the layered memories of a fragile community. The light shivers once, then steadies, guiding us back to a time when Frenier was no more than a scattering of wooden homes along the narrow ridge of land separating lake from swamp, a place where people lived close to the soil because they had no other choice. Life was spare, built with calloused hands and rooted in rhythms dictated not by clocks, but by weather, harvest, and the quiet agreements shared between neighbors who depended on one another for survival. It was here, in this world of sparse certainties and thick superstition, that Julia's story found its soil. The beginning of her life was not recorded with pen and paper, which was often reserved for the powerful, the wealthy, or the loudest voices, but her presence survived through the softer archives of memory. Her childhood, reconstructed through the faint threads of oral tradition, hints at an upbringing shaped by the blend of cultures that defined Louisiana in the years after Reconstruction. African beliefs braided with Catholic rituals, Creole practices intertwined with indigenous echoes. Children in such places learned early that the spiritual world was not distant or abstract. It pressed close, traveling on breath, on touch, on the murmur of elders who spoke of forces not entirely visible but always near. In these early impressions, perhaps, lay the first seeds of her future identity. But her beginning was not marked by power or notoriety. Instead, she grew into a role shaped by necessity. Small towns relied on those who understood healing, whether through botanical knowledge or spiritual reassurance, and Julia became one of those people. She learned to read the earth in ways that written language could not capture. She learned the scents of medicinal leaves, the patterns of fever, the timing of sickness that rose after storms or settled in winter's damp chill. As she matured, people began to visit her quietly, often at dusk or early morning, carrying illnesses that doctors would not travel this far to see. They brought her children burning with fever, husbands injured by tools, wives weakened by childbirth or exhaustion, and she helped them as she could, her remedies simple, her touch steady. It was this reliability, this quiet constancy, that earned her the earliest form of her reputation. The community saw in her a figure who straddled two worlds, the ordinary world of daily toil and the world that hovered just beyond explanation. They did not yet call her a priestess, they simply trusted her, though trust, in such places, often traveled hand in hand with unease. Over time, stories began to form around her, as stories often do around those whose skill feels larger than logic. A child recovering unexpectedly, a fever breaking after a whispered prayer, a storm passing a little too swiftly after she muttered to the sky. None of these events, by themselves, proved anything. But stories do not require proof to grow. They require only repetition. And in a quiet town, repetition was abundant. Her nickname emerged gradually, shaped more by the community's need to define her than by anything she declared herself to be. They called her the Voodoo Priestess of Frenier, though she might never have used that word. It was a label crafted from equal parts reverence and fear, a way for the townspeople to place boundaries around the power they sensed in her and did not fully understand. The word voodoo, already burdened with misunderstanding and projection, became a vessel into which they poured all their unnamed anxieties. Yet the nickname did not begin with hostility. In its earliest form, it held respect. Priestess implied someone who stood close to forces that others approached with caution, someone who listened to the unspoken language of suffering and responded with remedies that seemed to come from a deeper well. Still, it also created a distance. Titles have a way of lifting a person slightly above or away from the world that named them, and Julia's new title placed her at the town's center and its edge simultaneously. Over time, the stories surrounding her deepened. Some claimed she knew when misfortune was coming. Others insisted she could sense the presence of illness before it revealed itself. A few whispered that she walked the line between blessing and curse, though such whispers usually came from those who feared needing her help more than they feared her power. The nickname grew heavier as the years passed, fed by each event the community could not explain. And because people rarely recall events with perfect accuracy, stories stretched, bent, and fused until the woman and the myth became intertwined. This merging formed the foundation of her legend, and like many legends, it began not with spectacle but with subtle moments amplified by retelling. Imagine her walking through the town at dusk, her steps unhurried, her presence drawing quiet glances, children watching her from behind porch railings, adults nodding respectfully, though with a caution that revealed their uncertainty. She was neither feared outright nor loved without conditions. She existed in that delicate space reserved for those who heal, valued, needed, but never fully embraced. Her beginning, then, is not the story of a supernatural figure born into mystery, but of a woman who stepped into a role shaped by communal perception. Over time, the nickname she carried became the filter through which every gesture, every silence, every sigh was interpreted. And because labels often reveal more about the society that creates them than about the person who bears them, Julia's title reflects the anxieties, hopes, and beliefs of Frenier as much as it reflects her own identity. The swamp around her remained the silent witness. Its reeds swayed with each rumor, each new description of her skills, each attempt to categorize what could not be easily named. In the stillness of early morning, when mist rose from the marsh like a slow exhale, her figure could be seen gathering herbs, her silhouette soft against the rising light. To some, she was a healer. To others, a keeper of secrets. To many, both. And one question lingered, quietly yet persistently, in the minds of those who watched her from a distance. Who was she before the nickname took hold, before the stories hardened into legend? The answer, like the swamp's reflection, shifted depending on where one stood, yet the nickname remained, fixed and unyielding, the label through which her life would be remembered long after the town that named her dissolved into water and sorrow. And as that nickname settles once more into the silence of our telling, listen for the soft creak of her porch boards as the image returns, the same one we left behind, an elderly woman sitting alone, humming to herself in a tune the town would later fear. That humming lingers now, faint but unmistakable, leading us into the next turn of her story. That faint humming, drifting across the porch and dissolving into the humid air, opens the doorway to the first lesson of her life, a lesson shaped not by triumph, but by the slow accumulation of moments that revealed to Julia the fragile balance between guidance and solitude. The humming fades, yet its vibration remains like a hand resting lightly on the edge of memory, urging us back to the years when she first understood that those who heal inevitably stand apart from those they serve. It was not a sudden revelation, but a quiet unfolding, the kind that approaches softly over time until one day it settles inside a person like an undeniable truth. In the early days, when she first began tending to her neighbors, she did so without hesitation. She gave remedies freely, asked for nothing, and carried an unwavering belief that care, once offered, returned in some form to the giver. For a while, this belief seemed justified. Grateful faces, quiet thanks, a sense of belonging. But gratitude is delicate, easily shaken by misfortune or fear, and somewhere in the rhythm of her daily life, the first cracks began to form. Perhaps it started with a single illness she could not cure, a fever that refused to break, or a wound that deepened despite her efforts. In small communities, suffering seeks explanations, and when no clear cause presents itself, the human mind stumbles toward blame. People who once approached her with trust now wondered why her knowledge had failed them. They did not accuse her openly, not yet, but their silence lengthened. Their eyes lingered too long on her hands, as though those hands held answers she had hidden. Julia learned then that the path of the healer was a path of both gratitude and suspicion, and that even the gentlest acts could become entangled in expectations she had never agreed to bear. This was the first lesson. Not that people were unkind, but that their fear was greater than their understanding. Fear, especially in isolated places where nature could turn hostile without warning, needed an object, and often the object became the one who stood closest to mystery. She began to move more quietly through the town, aware that her presence attracted both need and unease. Some sought her out with desperate hope, clinging to her remedies as though she could shield them from all misfortune. Others approached her only when circumstances left them no other option, their voices tinged with reluctance. And there were a few who avoided her altogether, spreading small murmurs that she knew too much, that her knowledge came from a place not meant for ordinary people. These murmurs never reached her directly, but she recognized their shape in the way certain conversations paused when she stepped near, in the way some neighbors stiffened, as though bracing for an unseen force. Even so, she continued her work, understanding that service rarely grants protection from misunderstanding. The lesson deepened one storm season, when days of dark clouds and rising winds left the community anxious. Livestock fell ill, crops soured in the field. A child was nearly swept into the water by a sudden surge. The town turned inward, searching for meaning in the chaos. Some sought Julia, begging for prayers and guidance. Others whispered that the storms were connected to her in ways no one wished to name. She saw, in their trembling hands and lowered eyes, the unspoken conflict that lived inside them. They wanted her help, yet feared her presence. This contradiction became the quiet burden she carried, a weight that pressed upon her each time she sensed distress gathering in the town. She did not resent them. Instead, she observed them with a calm that came from years of listening to the land's rhythms, years of seeing hardship repeat itself in cycles that no human could control. Still, she felt the growing distance, the way people expected her to intervene in forces far beyond her reach. It was during this time that she first understood the loneliness that accompanies those who stand at the threshold between the practical and the spiritual. To heal, she realized, was to take on the suffering of others without asking them to recognize the cost. This understanding shaped not only her work but her inner life. She began to keep more to herself, spending evenings walking the narrow paths around Frenier, listening to the sound of frogs in the reeds, the gentle rustling of the lake against the shore. The landscape, in its vastness, offered the companionship that people could not. In the solitude of these walks, she reflected on the nature of service and the delicate line between help and dependence. She saw how communities, under strain, could easily shift from gratitude to fear when the world no longer obeyed their expectations. She understood that by helping them, she had stepped into a role they would never allow her to walk away from. But she also saw that such roles are rarely given out of generosity. They are shaped by need, and need is a restless force. As the years unfolded, she came to sense the deeper truth that would define her life. A healer may guide, but she can never control the way others interpret her presence. The stories people tell do not belong to the one they describe. They belong to the fears, hopes, and desires of those who tell them. This realization, subtle but powerful, became the cornerstone of her inner philosophy. It taught her to move with a quiet detachment, offering help when asked, yet knowing she would always be both trusted and doubted. The lesson was neither bitter nor resigned. It was simply the shape of reality, the way water follows the channel carved for it by time. And so she continued, humming softly on her porch in the evenings, letting the vibrations carry away the heaviness of the day. Her tune, gentle and unhurried, expressed what words could not: the acceptance of a life spent in service to others who did not fully see her. That humming grows again now, returning to us across the years, steady and low, as if preparing to lead us into the next height of her story. For in the space between trust and fear, admiration and unease, something else was forming, something rising quietly toward its peak, where the town's dependence on Julia would reach its summit before the shadows lengthened. That low, steady humming widens into a deeper current now, drawing us upward into the moment when Julia's presence reached its quiet summit. A height not marked by ceremony or acclaim, but by the way every path in Frenier seemed, at one point or another, to lead back to her small wooden home. It was a height built not on ambition, but on the slow, layered accumulation of years in which the town leaned a little more heavily upon her, until even those who feared her found themselves gauging their days by her gestures, studying her silences, listening for her voice drifting through the stillness of late afternoon. At this summit, Julia Brown became something more than a healer. She became a center of gravity, the invisible axis around which the most fragile hopes of Frenier revolved. The townspeople did not admit this openly, for it is rare that people acknowledge the quiet authority of a figure who stands outside their social order, someone who did not inherit power but seemed to draw it from a deeper source. Yet their actions revealed the truth. They came to her in times of sickness. They sought her counsel when storms gathered on the horizon. They asked her to bless their children, their harvests, even their homes. And when misfortune passed them by, many attributed their safety not to chance but to the unseen barrier they believed her presence provided. This belief, born from gratitude but shaped by superstition, elevated Julia to a place neither she nor the town fully understood. Her voice, once just a woman's voice humming on a porch, became to some a sign of protection, to others a warning. She had no formal title, no official role, yet the town moved around her as though she were its quiet, unspoken guardian. It was in these years that the stories about her seemed to multiply, carried from one household to the next. Children repeated tales they had overheard, shaping her image into that of a figure who knew the secrets of the earth and the sky. Adults, though wary of exaggeration, nonetheless found themselves drawn to the idea that Julia sensed what they could not, that she had a way of perceiving the world that lay beyond ordinary sight. Not all stories were favorable, of course. Influence of any kind attracts shadows. When misfortune struck a family she had once helped, some whispered that her remedies had failed by design. When a storm damaged one corner of the town but spared another, others wondered whether her attention had followed personal loyalties. These whispers, fragile yet persistent, served only to deepen the aura around her. Authority built from silence often provokes more speculation than authority proclaimed aloud. Julia said little in response. She continued her work with the same calm she had always carried, neither denying nor feeding the growing mythology that surrounded her. Her silence became part of her power. People interpreted it in ways that suited their needs. If she remained quiet when someone sought reassurance, they said she was contemplating unseen forces. If she spoke plainly, they said she was choosing her words to align with hidden knowledge. Everything became a sign. Everything became part of the legend. The peak of her influence arrived not in a single moment, but in a gradual ascent, like the slow climb of river water after a season of heavy rain. Yet if one were to choose a symbol for this summit, it would be the song she began to hum more frequently in those years. A gentle, repetitive tune with words that drifted between prophecy and lament, spoken so softly that only those close to her porch could make them out. They said she sang that when she died, the town would die with her. And because she offered no explanation, the words settled into the collective consciousness of Frenier with a weight that only grew over time. Some dismissed the song as an old woman's stray reflection on mortality, a poetic expression shaped by age and fatigue. Others heard in it a warning, a kind of spiritual pronouncement from a woman whose life had always lingered at the edge of the ordinary. Still others feared it was not a warning at all, but a promise. Whatever the interpretation, the melody took root in the town's imagination, and with each repetition, it grew into something larger than itself. People began to watch her more closely. They spoke in softer voices when she walked by. They treated her presence with the kind of reverence offered to someone believed capable of shifting the balance between safety and danger. Even those who doubted her influence did not entirely dismiss her song. Doubt, in places shaped by nature's unpredictability, is rarely a clean break from belief. It hovers somewhere in between, leaving enough room for uncertainty to flourish. Julia herself seemed unchanged. She sang while rocking slowly on her porch, her gaze drifting toward the lake as though following currents only she could see. She tended to the sick. She offered remedies. She moved through the town with the same steady pace she had always carried, and yet something in her posture suggested she understood the shift around her. The town had placed upon her a mantle she had not chosen, one that grew heavier with each passing season. At her summit, she was both central and isolated, needed yet feared, admired yet misunderstood, the kind of figure whose presence, once magnified by the collective imagination, could never again return to its original form. Those who saw her in those final years often recalled the way her voice traveled across the still water at dusk. The song, soft and rhythmic, floated through the humid air and lingered above the reeds long after her lips had fallen silent. Whether she meant the words as prophecy or metaphor, no one could say. But the town listened, and the town remembered. The summit of her influence was not marked by dominance, but by resonance. Her life had become interwoven with the fate of Frenier in ways neither she nor its residents could fully articulate. And as her song fades again now, carried off into the imagined wind of our telling, it leaves behind a single, trembling echo that guides us forward. The echo of a prophecy unfinished, inviting us to step into the next, deeper layer of her story. That trembling echo, thin as a thread of breath yet steady as a heartbeat, widens now into the symbol at the center of her story, the quiet object around which memory gathers like silt around a stone in a slow-moving river. Every life, no matter how ordinary or extraordinary, leaves behind a symbol, something that holds the weight of meaning long after the person has vanished. For Julia Brown, that symbol was not a relic made of wood or bone, nor an artifact preserved behind glass. It was a song, a simple melody carried by her voice, a sequence of notes so gentle that at first it seemed like nothing more than a private habit of an aging woman. But in the landscape of Frenier, where stories traveled faster than explanations and where silence itself felt like a living presence, the melody deepened into something no longer hers alone. It became the axis around which her legend would turn. Imagine her sitting on that familiar porch, the boards warm beneath her palms, the air heavy with the scent of cypress and damp earth. She begins to hum, barely louder than the wind brushing the reeds, the words merging with the rhythm of her rocking chair. At first, no one pays attention. Her neighbors hear the tune in passing, recognizing the comfort of a voice that had soothed countless fevers and whispered prayers over frightened children. But the repetition of the song gives it power. The same lines, the same cadence, sung again and again until repetition becomes ritual. And when a ritual grows familiar, meaning begins to grow around it like vines climbing a wall. Her song became a symbol because the town gave it one. In places where written records were scarce and memory depended on the spoken word, a phrase repeated enough times could become a prophecy, whether or not the speaker intended it as such. When Julia sang that when she died, the town would die with her, the words nestled into the minds of those who heard them. Some dismissed them as the melancholic reflection of an aging woman contemplating her own mortality. Others felt an unease they could not name, and still others held the words close, whispering them to one another during late-night storms when the wind moaned through the shutters, making the fragile structures of Frenier tremble. The power of the symbol was not in the literal meaning of the words but in the way the town interpreted them. People built stories around what they feared or hoped to understand. For some, the song symbolized protection. As long as she lived, Frenier would stand. For others, it symbolized judgment, that the town had leaned too heavily upon her, had misunderstood her, had taken from her without giving in return. And for still others, it symbolized inevitability, that the forces shaping their lives were larger than any one person, and Julia's song merely revealed what had always been true. Symbols rarely remain fixed. They morph with each telling, each interpretation, each new generation that inherits the old stories. The melody became not just her voice but the town's conscience, a mirror held up to its anxieties. It echoed the fragility of life in a place where nature shaped the boundaries of existence. Hurricanes, floods, illnesses that swept through without warning. In such a world, people needed symbols to make sense of the unpredictable. And Julia's song, gentle yet haunting, provided one. The physical world around her responded in ways that lent further strength to the symbol. When the air grew heavy before a storm, her voice seemed to travel farther, drifting across the lake until it became indistinguishable from the wind. When night fell and lantern light flickered through cracks in the wooden walls, her tune carried through the darkness like a thread, connecting one home to the next. Children who could not sleep imagined her voice weaving a protective net around the town. Adults lying awake after long days of labor wondered whether the words hinted at something they had overlooked. Her song became a lens through which the town interpreted both fortune and misfortune. A good harvest was attributed to her blessings. A sudden illness became a test of her goodwill. A shift in weather carried whispers that she had sensed it before anyone else. Over time, the melody took on the weight of inevitability, as though it belonged not to a single woman but to the land itself. And because symbols often hold what people cannot articulate, the song became the vessel for all the unspoken tensions that lived within Frenier. Its dependence on her, its fear of her, its admiration, its guilt, its longing for stability in a world that rarely provided it. The song absorbed all of these emotions and returned them to the community in a form they could hold on to. A symbol does not explain, it reflects. It gathers what lies beneath the surface and reveals it in a single, memorable shape. And the shape Julia left behind was the shape of a prophecy sung in a soft voice, a prophecy that lingered long after her lips no longer moved. As we follow the melody now, drifting like smoke through the dim corridors of memory, it leads us to the next turning of her story, where the symbol she created begins to stretch across the stages of her life. The humming fades, but the vibration remains, carrying us into the slow passage of time and the transformations that shaped her path. That lingering vibration carries us now into the long arc of her life, a quiet unfolding marked not by grand turning points, but by the slow, steady progression through the stages that shape every human existence. Time in Frenier did not move with the sharp edges of cities or the hurried pulse of crowded streets. It drifted like the lake water, shifting with the seasons, deepening with storms, softening with heat. And within this rhythm, Julia's life moved through youth, adulthood, and age as though guided by the same invisible tide. To understand her story, one must picture the early years when she was still young, before the song, before the title of priestess, when her world consisted of the marsh paths she walked barefoot and the quiet rituals of survival that defined life at the water's edge. These years shaped her senses. The sounds of frogs calling at dusk became her first teachers. The smell of wet earth after a storm taught her the timing of harvests. The pattern of wind across the lake revealed warnings long before clouds appeared in the distance. Youth in such a place did not offer abundance, but it offered clarity. It taught her to listen to what others overlooked, to observe without speaking, to understand that people and land are bound by forces both visible and unseen. As she passed into adulthood, these understandings deepened. she became someone others sought out not only for remedies but for the grounding presence she carried. People recognized in her a calm that came not from detachment but from intimacy with the cycles of life around her. They saw that storms did not unsettle her. Illness did not shake her. Hardship did not draw from her the bitterness it drew from so many others. Her adulthood became the period when she stepped naturally into the role Frenier would come to define her by, not through a sudden decision, but through the incremental weaving of trust, responsibility, and quiet expectation. The town leaned on her more heavily during these years. Children grew into adults knowing her voice as part of the landscape. Elders came to her in the final stages of their lives seeking comfort. Mothers visited her with infants who cried through the night. Workers came with injuries earned under the sun. And with each request, each plea, each moment of fear or gratitude, Julia felt herself pulled deeper into the fabric of the community, even as she remained somehow apart from it. In the middle years of her life, there was a grace in her movements, an ease born of routine. She gathered herbs along familiar paths. She listened to the wind in the cypress branches. She tended to the living and honored the dead. She understood the fragility of her neighbors' lives, not as a tragedy, but as a truth, a reminder that mortality was not a flaw but a rhythm all beings shared. And yet, even then, beneath her steady composure, she sensed the beginning of a subtle shift. Authority, once offered to her through gratitude, began to feel more like obligation. People depended on her not only for healing, but for reassurance, for certainty in a world that rarely offered it. This dependence grew heavier as the years passed. Midlife brought not only responsibility, but isolation. The more the town relied on her, the more she recognized the distance that her role created. She could not be simply a neighbor anymore. She could not be someone to confide in casually or sit beside at a gathering without someone seeking meaning in her smallest gestures. Her presence comforted others, but it also unsettled them. They needed her, yet they feared the extent of her understanding. They admired her, yet whispered about what they could not name. In her later years, age softened her body but sharpened the contours of her aura. She wore her solitude with quiet acceptance, knowing it was the natural progression of a life lived in service. Her walks through the swamp became slower but more deliberate, as though she were revisiting each place that had shaped her, smoothing the edges of old memories. Children who once ran to her now approached with solemn respect. Adults watched her movements more closely, interpreting even her silences as signs. Age brought her a kind of visibility she had never sought. Her presence carried weight, and with that weight came expectation. People began to interpret the smallest changes in her behavior. If she looked toward the lake too long, they wondered what she sensed. If she paused before entering her home, they whispered that she was listening to forces beyond their comprehension. This was the stage of her life when the song took root, when her voice carried not just melody, but the gravity of a lifetime lived on the boundary between the seen and the unseen. The older she grew, the more her identity fused with her legend. She had become, in the minds of many, a figure both human and more than human, someone who embodied the mysteries of the swamp itself. The decline of her physical body did not diminish her presence. In fact, it amplified it. Frailty made her seem closer to the threshold she had always straddled, and people watched her with a mixture of reverence and dread, as though her aging marked not only her own nearing end, but the beginning of something larger, something tied to the fate of Frenier itself. These stages of her life, youth shaped by the land, adulthood shaped by service, age shaped by solitude, flowed into one another like the slow turning of the lake. No stage erased the one before it. Instead, each deepened her understanding of her place within the world. And as her story moves now from the progression of her years to the inner compass that guided her through them, the gentle fading of her song leads us toward the philosophy she carried within her and the figure who would one day guard her legacy. The melody softens, echoing faintly across the imagined water, inviting us to step quietly into the realm of her beliefs and the one who kept them alive. That soft fading of her melody guides us now into the quiet interior of her life, into the chambers where belief and discipline shaped her more profoundly than any role the town placed upon her. For behind the legend, beneath the whispers and the caution and the reverence, lived a philosophy formed from decades of listening to the land, to suffering, to the subtle movements of time. Her beliefs were not written in books or codified in rituals passed through formal instruction. They emerged instead from observation and humility, from a lifelong awareness that human beings occupy only a narrow slice of a world far older and more intricate than they often recognize. Julia understood early that the boundary between the natural and the spiritual was not a barrier but a transition, a gradient where energies blended. She believed that healing required acknowledging this gradient, that the body and the unseen forces surrounding it were inseparable. Illness, to her, was not merely a physical affliction, but a disturbance in balance between person and place, between individual and community, between one season of life and the next. Her remedies reflected this belief. She used plants not only for their medicinal properties but for their symbolic resonance, choosing herbs that aligned with the emotional and spiritual state of the person before her. She spoke softly when tending to the sick, not because she feared disturbing them, but because she believed illness listened, just as the land listened, just as the ancestors listened. Silence, in her philosophy, was not emptiness, but depth, a space where the unseen could gather. Her moral compass rested on a simple but profound principle: all things seek balance. If balance is lost, suffering emerges. If balance is restored, peace returns. This principle shaped her actions, her sorrows, her cautions, and her expectations. She never sought to control the forces she perceived. Instead, she sought to align with them, to understand their rhythms. She believed that interference beyond necessity was a kind of arrogance, a presumption that humans possessed more authority than they truly did. This restraint, this profound unwillingness to overreach, was perhaps the quality that most separated her from the myths others created about her. While the town imagined she commanded powers, she believed she accompanied them, walked alongside them, listened to them. She treated life not as a hierarchy of beings, but as a network of relationships, each thread affecting the others. And because she moved with such awareness, she carried an aura that others interpreted as mastery, when in truth it was reverence. Yet a belief system, no matter how deeply held, rarely survives without a guardian, someone who witnesses, remembers, and carries its essence forward after its bearer has passed. For Julia, that guardian did not come in the form of a successor trained in her practices. Instead, it arrived in the form of a witness, someone whose life intersected with hers at an angle that allowed memory to become preservation. Some say it was a younger neighbor who often lingered near her porch, quietly absorbing her songs and gestures. Others say it was a distant relative who visited occasionally, drawn by an unspoken responsibility to ensure that her story did not disappear. Still others believe the guardian was not a single person but a communal memory embodied by the few who survived the destruction that would follow her death. But among these possibilities, there is a quieter, truer answer. The guardian was the one who watched without asking too much, who noticed the details that others overlooked, the way her gaze softened when she touched the soil, the intention behind her pauses, the sense of peace she carried even when storms gathered. This figure, whether outsider or kin, whether named or anonymous, held onto the fragments of her philosophy and preserved them in words, in gestures, in retellings offered years later when the world around Frenier had changed beyond recognition. The guardian understood that Julia's beliefs did not belong to spells or curses or the dramatic language others attached to her. They belonged to attentiveness, to humility, to the acceptance that life cannot be commanded but must be understood. And so, as the town's memory fractured after the storm that would one day erase it, the guardian became the quiet thread that kept Julia's inner world from being lost entirely. Through this guardian, her philosophy endured not as doctrine, but as atmosphere, as tone, as the faint echo of a worldview that saw harmony as the highest form of wisdom. And even now, as we listen across the widening distance of time, that worldview moves around her story like a soft breeze across still water. It reminds us that her life was not defined by fear or by power, but by alignment with the land, with the suffering of others, with the slow unfolding of existence. The presence of the guardian, holding her memory with care, brings us to the threshold of the final turn in her journey, where life moves toward its last chapter, and her song begins its descent into silence. The melody grows thinner now, drifting into the shadows where endings gather, inviting us to step with quiet reverence into the story of her death and the final, haunting word she left behind. That thinning melody, stretched now to the edge of hearing, leads us into the final descent of her life, into the space where endings draw near, and every gesture takes on the weight of closure. The air around her seemed to change in those last weeks, not in dramatic ways but in subtle shifts that those attuned to her presence felt instinctively. The lake grew particularly still on certain evenings, as though listening. The wind moved differently through the cypress branches, slower, more deliberate, almost cautious. And the town, whether consciously or not, sensed that the quiet force at its center was approaching the moment when her journey would release its final breath. Age had settled deeply into her body by then. Her hands, once steady and sure, trembled slightly when she ground herbs or tied bundles of plants with twine. Her steps grew shorter, her voice softer. But her mind remained alert, her senses tuned to the delicate balance that had always guided her. She felt the nearing of her own departure not as fear but as recognition, as though she were listening to the closing notes of a song she had sung her entire life. In those days, she spent more time on her porch than she had in many years, watching the light shift across the lake, humming the melody that had woven itself into the identity of Frenier. She did not speak of her impending death, but her stillness carried an understanding that words could not carry, and the town felt it too. People approached her with quiet hesitation, unsure whether to seek comfort or offer it. Some asked for blessings, sensing that her time was short, and wanting to hold on to a piece of her presence before it faded. Others lingered nearby without speaking, simply needing to see her, to witness her calm as a counterweight to their rising unease. And then there were those who avoided her altogether, fearing that proximity to a woman they believed connected to unseen forces might draw them into something they could not control. In this tension, in this quiet swirl of reverence and apprehension, the days moved steadily toward the moment of her passing. The night before she died was marked by an unusual stillness. The air hung heavy around Frenier, thick with an almost electric anticipation. Lanterns flickered inside small wooden homes, but outside, the darkness felt denser than usual, as though the sky had drawn closer to the earth. Julia sat on her porch beneath that dense sky, humming her familiar tune with a softness that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. Some later claimed they heard her voice that night drifting farther than ever across the water, carried gently by a wind too faint to stir the trees. Others said the swamp grew silent, as if the night itself leaned closer to listen. By morning, she was gone. They found her seated in the same wooden chair, her hands resting peacefully in her lap, her eyes closed as though she had simply drifted into a deeper form of sleep. No struggle, no sign of suffering. Her departure was as quiet as the life she had lived, a release as gentle as breath returning to the air. But her death, simple as it appeared, did not end in stillness. Fate, or coincidence, or the unpredictable violence of nature, whatever name one chooses, moved swiftly in the hours that followed. Before the day was out, winds began to rise from the southeast, gathering strength over the warm waters of the Gulf. Dark clouds assembled with unnerving speed. By evening, the air was pulsing with pressure, the lake lifting in agitation. And then, as night returned for the second time in 2 days, the storm struck. The hurricane of 1915 tore across Frenier with a ferocity that reshaped the land itself. Winds ripped homes from their foundations. Water surged from the lake, swallowing the town in its path. trees bent and broke, entire families clung to whatever they could grasp in the darkness. The storm did not pause, it did not spare. By morning, the town was no more. What once had been a humble cluster of wooden houses and railroad ties lay scattered across the landscape like remnants of a dream shattered upon waking. Survivors, few in number, emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition, carrying with them not only the physical trauma of the storm, but the memory of Julia's final song. And in their grief, their shock, their need to make sense of the senseless, they remembered her words, that when she died, the town would die with her. In that moment, the symbol hardened into legend. Her death and the destruction became inseparable in the minds of those who lived through it. Stories of her final days grew more vivid with each retelling. Some said she had foreseen the storm. Others claimed she had tried to warn them. A few whispered that the hurricane itself was her final utterance, her last unspoken word delivered through the voice of wind and water. And yet, the truth remained simple and unadorned. She died quietly, and nature moved violently in the hours that followed. Whether coincidence or prophecy, no one could say with certainty. But the human heart rarely chooses uncertainty when a story offers meaning. Her last word, if she spoke one, was never recorded. Perhaps it lived in the final breath that passed her lips. Perhaps it lingered in the final note of her song. Or perhaps her last word was not a word at all, but the silence she left behind, a silence that grew louder when the storm consumed everything around it. That silence now stretches before us, leading into the final chapter of her story, where memory and myth settle into place and her legacy begins to take shape across the long years after her death. That silence, vast and unmoving in the wake of her passing, becomes the foundation on which her legacy was built, a legacy shaped not by the details of her daily life, but by the echo that remained after the storm stripped Frenier from the earth. In the years that followed, long after the broken planks were carried away by receding waters, and long after the survivors scattered to new towns, new rail lines, new lives, the memory of Julia Brown did not fade. Instead, it deepened, settling first into the voices of those who had known her, then into the whispers of their children, and finally into the collective imagination of Louisiana itself. The town that had once depended on her no longer existed, but the story of the woman who sang of its fate endured with surprising clarity, as though her presence had imprinted itself upon the landscape even after the buildings were gone. People returned to the ruins in later decades, standing on the quiet shoreline where Frenier once stood, and though nothing of the community remained, they felt the weight of narrative pressing against the stillness. Some claimed the air seemed heavier there. Others said they heard faint humming when the wind shifted across the reeds. Whether these sensations arose from memory, superstition, or the echoes of natural sound, they contributed to the shaping of her legend, giving her story a place to live long after her physical home had vanished. Over time, the tale of Julia Brown expanded, acquiring layers that reflected not only the facts of her life, but the fears and fascinations of those who retold it. In some versions, she became a protective guardian whose warnings went unheeded. In others, she became a figure of quiet retribution, balancing the scales after years of being misunderstood. In still others, she was neither benevolent nor vengeful, but simply attuned to forces larger than human comprehension. Each version carried a different moral, a different reflection of the storyteller's inner world, and in this way her legacy became a mirror, one that revealed more about each generation than about the woman herself. Yet beneath these shifting interpretations, beneath the embellishments and the atmospheric details added over time, one truth remained steady: she was remembered. And for a woman who lived in a time and place where so many lives passed undocumented, unrecorded, unacknowledged, the endurance of her memory was itself a form of honor. Her story resurfaced in books, in conversations, in folklore shared by families who had no direct connection to Frenier but felt drawn to the eerie beauty of its demise. She became a figure woven into the broader tapestry of Louisiana's haunted past, standing alongside legends born from bayous, plantations, graveyards, and storms. But unlike many of those tales, often shaped by spectacle, tragedy, or theatrics, Julia's legacy held a quieter resonance. It spoke not of violence or malice, but of mystery, of the thin boundary between human life and the forces that shape it. Her song, once a personal expression murmured into the dusk, became a symbol of the fragile thread connecting existence to inevitability. And because symbols travel farther than facts, her voice found its way into countless retellings, carrying with it the reminder that small acts, small words, small murmurs can ripple outward in ways no one can predict. In the decades after the storm, researchers, storytellers, and wanderers traced the remnants of her life, piecing together fragments from oral history, property records, census lines, and local memory. They found little in the way of concrete biography, no journals, no written testimonies, only glimpses of a woman who lived quietly yet left behind one of the most enduring legends in the region. This absence of documentation only strengthened her myth, for in the absence of clarity, imagination flourishes. Meanwhile, the ruins of Frenier became a kind of pilgrimage point for those drawn to the intersection of history and the uncanny. Visitors stood on the old railroad line, now reclaimed by vegetation, and wondered how a town could disappear so completely, leaving behind only a story and the faint impression of a presence that lingered in the air. It was here, in the interplay between memory and emptiness, that Julia's legacy found its true home, not in monuments or plaques or preserved buildings, but in the way people felt when they stood upon the land where she once lived. A kind of tremor, a subtle awareness of something unresolved. This unresolved quality is what carried her story across generations. It allowed her to become more than a historical figure. She became a question, a doorway, a voice drifting through time. And the question her story poses is not whether she predicted the hurricane or whether her song summoned destruction. The question is simpler, more profound. How do human lives, particularly quiet ones, become larger after they are gone? The legacy of Julia Brown invites us to consider the ways in which memory shapes truth, how communities process fear through narrative, how a single voice, soft, steady, persistent, can echo far beyond its own lifetime. Her story endures because it touches something universal. The desire to understand what lies beyond our control, the impulse to find meaning in the convergence of human fate and natural force, the longing to believe that lives matter even when history leaves little trace of them. And so, her name continues to drift across the years, carried by storytellers, researchers, musicians, and wanderers, each adding their own inflection to the melody she once hummed into the dusk. Her song, though no longer heard by living ears, remains alive in the collective imagination, its cadence shaping the atmosphere around her memory. As we stand now at the conclusion of her story, we return to the place where all legends live, the twilight between certainty and wonder. The swamp grows quiet, the water reflects a muted sky, and in the distance, so faint it could be imagination, a soft humming rises, an echo of a life that outlasted its town, a reminder that some stories do not end but continue to vibrate in the spaces where silence holds them. There, in that lingering vibration,